The first time I saw him, he was kneeling beside a row of rose bushes, hands deep in the Kansas dirt, the morning sun painting everything gold. The air smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, maybe the promise of rain, maybe the flowers themselves. Behind him stretched the wide, flat fields of the old airfield, where time had traded the echo of engines for the whisper of wind through tall grass. His name was Samuel Whitaker, though most folks around here just called him Sam. He wasn't famous or wealthy, just a quiet man who kept to himself, tending to his land on the edge of what used to be the training base for young pilots during the war. You could still see the faint outlines of the runways if you stood high enough, long, cracked ribbons of concrete where weeds had claimed their victory, but Sam didn't plow over them. He planted roses instead, thousands of them. He said the soil was good, full of limestone and memory, and maybe that's why the roses grew the way they did, thick and bright and wild, as though they carried the heartbeat of something once fierce and now forgiven. No one really knew when he started. Some said it was right after the war ended, when the airfield fell silent and the army packed up and left. Others claimed he began the very next spring, after a storm rolled through and uncovered a rusted badge near the edge of the field, one with wings engraved into the metal. All we knew was that every May, when the first buds opened, Sam would walk the rows slowly, his straw hat tipped low, humming something soft, a tune nobody could name. I used to ride past his farm on my bicycle after school. I was 14 then, too young to understand much about war, but old enough to sense that his flowers meant something more than beauty. My father once told me, "That man's saying thank you the only way he knows how." When I asked Sam about it one afternoon, he just smiled and said, "Every rose is a word I never got to say." I didn't press him after that. The truth was, those fields didn't look like a memorial. There were no plaques, no flags, no speeches. Just rows of colors stretching toward the horizon. Crimson, ivory, soft pink, and gold. They caught the light at sunset in a way that made the whole place glow, like the earth itself was remembering. Sometimes when the wind was just right, you could still hear faint sounds, or maybe imagine them, the ghostly hum of propellers, the voices of boys calling to each other, laughter carried on the air. Sam said the land never forgets what it witnesses. It just waits for someone to make peace with it. He never spoke about who he lost, but you could guess. There was a photograph in his kitchen window, a black and white picture of a group of young men standing beside a plane, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Sam was one of them, I think. His hand rested on the shoulder of a boy with a crooked grin, the kind you only see once in a lifetime. He never said which one didn't come back. Every spring, the town folks would drive out to see the roses bloom. They'd bring children, picnic baskets, and cameras, but Sam never asked for attention. He just nodded politely, tipping his hat, and went back to tending the soil. Someone once offered to buy the land, said it would make a fine subdivision. Sam declined before the man even finished his sentence. "You don't pave over gratitude," he said simply, and walked away. I didn't understand back then what those words meant, but now, years later, when I think of him kneeling in the dirt with the wind in his hair and the smell of roses in the air, I realize gratitude doesn't shout. It blooms quietly, season after season, long after the world has stopped paying attention. By the summer of 1950, Sam's roses had become something of a legend in our corner of Kansas. They weren't just flowers anymore, they were a season. When May came, the town seemed to lean toward his fields like a congregation toward prayer. People started calling it the blooming ground. Couples took wedding photos there. Veterans stopped by quietly, hands in pockets, eyes low. Even the local paper ran a small column each spring titled, "Whitaker's Roses Return." But Sam never seemed to notice the attention. He worked with the same quiet rhythm, the same slow patience that seemed to come from another time. His back was straighter than most men his age, his hands steady, as he pruned each stem, talking softly to the plants, as if they could hear him, and maybe they could. I visited him more often as I grew older. I'd lean my bike against a fence and watch him work. The sun would burn low behind the old hangars, throwing long shadows over the field, and he'd tell me little things about soil, roots, weather, patience. He had a way of speaking that made ordinary things sound like scripture. One evening, while the air buzzed with cicadas and the roses glowed red against the dimming sky, I asked him the question that had lived in my mind for years. "Mr. Whitaker," I said, "why roses?" He didn't answer right away. He kept trimming a bush near his boots, the shears clicking softly. Then he said, "Because they remind me that beauty comes with thorns, always has, always will." He looked out over the rows and added, "I planted the first one where he crashed." It was the only time he ever mentioned him. He didn't need to say who. The silence that followed told me enough. After that, I started noticing small markers in the field, flat stones half buried in the soil, each carved with initials. Some were so worn by rain and sun that the letters had nearly vanished. Sam never pointed them out, but I counted 20 before I stopped looking. That night, when I got home, I asked my father if he knew anything about the airfield. He set down his paper and sighed. "Your Mr. Whitaker," he said, "was part of the training unit here during the war. They lost a few boys on takeoff. He was one of the lucky ones who made it home. But he never really came back." I thought about that for a long time. How a man could return to the same land, but not the same life. Over the next few years, the roses multiplied. Every winter he would dig new trenches, layering the roots with straw and compost. In the spring, he'd plant more, always in perfect lines, as though following a map only he could see. By the mid-50s, the old airfield had nearly disappeared under a sea of color. Only the control tower and a stretch of runway remained, like ghosts in a garden. Sometimes he'd let me help him plant. He taught me how to loosen the soil with care, how to feed the roots just enough, and how to watch the leaves for signs of stress. "Roses don't like hurry," he'd say. "They bloom when they're ready, not when you are." But there were moments when I'd catch him standing still, eyes far away, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The wind would lift the edges of his hat, and he'd whisper a name under his breath before bending back to work. One day, a letter arrived from Topeka. It was from the Veterans Administration, offering to purchase part of his property to build a memorial park. They promised funding, maintenance, recognition, all the official things. Sam thanked them for their offer and declined. "The land already remembers," he wrote back. When I asked him why he refused, he said, "Because monuments are built for people to look at. Roses are grown for people to feel." I didn't understand it fully then, but years later, when I saw families walking quietly among his flowers, their children running between rows, laughter mixing with the scent of earth and bloom, I began to. Those roses weren't graves. They were life continuing, color where there once was gray, fragrance where there once was smoke. He used to say that every spring was a second chance. You plant, he told me, not because you've forgotten, but because you remember. And that's what Sam did, year after year. He remembered, in petals, in soil, in sweat, in silence, in the simple act of coaxing beauty from a place once scarred by fear. I often wonder how many people driving past those fields understood what they were really looking at. To most, it was just a garden. To Sam, it was a promise kept. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Sam's roses had become a kind of quiet pilgrimage. People came from nearby towns just to walk those rows. Newlyweds, veterans, old friends who'd once trained in the skies above Kansas. Some brought small flags, others photographs tucked into their pockets, worn and folded from too many years of remembering. Sam never turned anyone away. He'd nod, offer a jug of water, and let them wander among the blooms. He didn't talk much, but his presence was enough. The calm weight of someone who understood loss without needing to name it. I was grown by then, working in town at the hardware store, but I still visited him on Sundays. The roses had multiplied again, covering nearly every acre of his land. The old airstrip was just a faint scar under the petals, barely visible unless you knew where to look. He was older, slower, his hands rougher, and his hearing fading, but his eyes still held that steady light, the kind that comes from a man who has made peace with both heaven and earth. One afternoon I found him, sitting on the edge of the field, with a wooden box on his lap. The air was thick with the smell of sun-warmed roses and the faint hum of bees. He motioned for me to sit beside him. Inside the box were stacks of envelopes, all the same, yellowed, unopened, tied with a single ribbon. Letters, he said simply. Never sent. He took one out and turned it in his fingers before handing it to me. The paper trembled slightly in the breeze, and I noticed the handwriting, careful, clean, unmistakably his. They were for him, Sam said, his voice low. The boy in the photograph. He didn't look at me when he spoke. His eyes were somewhere far beyond the horizon. I wrote every month after he went missing, he said. They told us he didn't make it. But I couldn't stop talking to him, so I wrote. He opened the top envelope carefully, as if it might crumble. Inside was a page filled with neat, looping script. The first line read, "Today the roses bloomed early, and the soil felt lighter than usual. I think you'd like it here." I read a few more lines before the words blurred. Sam smiled faintly. Every bush out there has one of his letters buried beneath it. I figured if the earth can grow roses, maybe it can carry a few words too. He closed the box and set it aside, then looked out over the field. You know, some people build fences to keep things out. Me, I built a garden to keep something in. That night I couldn't stop thinking about it. About the letters buried in the soil, the words soaking into roots and petals. Maybe that's why the roses grew the way they did. They were drinking in more than water. Years passed, and Sam grew frail. His back bent, his steps slowed, but he never stopped tending the roses. Even on days when the wind cut cold across the plains, he'd be out there in his coat and hat, pruning, feeding, whispering to the blooms like old friends. One spring, a group of high school students came by for a history project. They asked Sam if they could record his story. He agreed, though he said he didn't have much to tell. They filmed him sitting among the roses, his voice steady but soft. He talked about the airfield, about friendship, about the way the sky looked just before takeoff. And then he said something I'll never forget. War takes, but life gives back if you let it. I just decided to keep giving. When the recording ended, one of the students asked him what the roses meant now, after all these years. Sam smiled, brushed the dirt from his palms, and said, "They mean I kept my promise, that I didn't let forgetting win." It wasn't long after that when he fell ill. The doctor from town said his heart was simply tired. He stayed home, surrounded by the smell of flowers drifting through the open window. On the last day I saw him, he asked me to take care of the roses. "They know the seasons better than I do now," he said with a weak grin. He passed that night, quietly, like the fading of a breeze. The next morning the entire field was in bloom, weeks earlier than usual. People said it was just weather or timing, but I knew better. When we buried him, we didn't go to the cemetery. We laid him under the same stretch of soil where he'd first planted those roses, beside a stone marked only with his name and the year. The sun was low, and the air smelled of petals and promise. Someone said a prayer, but the silence afterward felt more honest than any words. That evening, as I walked through the field alone, I thought I heard something faint in the wind, a hum, a distant echo, like engines far above the clouds. I looked up, half expecting to see a formation of planes crossing the sky. But there was nothing, only the fading light and the endless field of roses. And I remember thinking, maybe that's the sound of peace. The years rolled on like the slow turning of a weathered wheel. I inherited Sam's land the way some people inherit a story, not through signatures or documents, but through quiet understanding. There was never any question of selling it. The thought alone would have felt like betrayal. By the early 1970s, the airfield roses had become part of Kansas folklore. The county added a small wooden sign by the road, Whitaker Field, Roses of Remembrance. Visitors still came, but fewer than before. The world was changing. Men walked on the moon. Machines grew smaller, faster, louder. Yet out there among the rows, time stayed gentle. Each spring I did what Sam had done, turned the soil, trimmed the thorns, whispered small thanks to the wind. At first, I thought I was just keeping a promise, but somewhere along the way, it became something else, a conversation. One evening I brought my daughter, Anna, to see the field for the first time. She was 9, curious, restless, her shoes kicking up dust along the narrow path between the bushes. The sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in the same warm gold I remembered from my boyhood. "Why do you grow them every year?" she asked. I thought about it before answering. "Because they remember," I said. She frowned a little, not quite understanding. "Remember what?" I knelt beside her and brushed a fallen petal from her sleeve. "The ones who flew from here, the ones who didn't come back, and the man who refused to let them be forgotten." She looked out over the endless rows of flowers, her small face serious. "Did you know him?" I nodded. "Yes, he was my teacher in ways he never realized." We walked in silence for a while. The air was thick with the scent of the blossoms. She stopped at a row of deep crimson roses and said softly, "They look like they're glowing." "They do," I said. "Every year they come back brighter." I didn't tell her about the letters buried beneath the soil. Not yet. Some stories need time before they're passed on. In the years that followed, Anna grew up with the roses the way I had, marking time not by birthdays or holidays, but by when the first buds appeared. She learned which roots needed the most care, which colors bloomed earliest, which ones were strongest against the wind. And every May, when the first petals opened, she'd leave a single flower at the small stone where Sam rested. Never more than one, just enough. By the 1980s, the world had almost forgotten the airfield entirely. The last of the veterans who remembered it had passed, their photographs fading on mantels and in dusty albums. But the roses kept blooming, season after season, unbothered by history's fading interest. Sometimes tour buses would stop, and people would take pictures, calling it beautiful. But those who lingered long enough always left quiet, touched by something they couldn't quite name. One spring an old woman visited with her grandson. She said her brother had trained here during the war. He never came home, she whispered. When she saw the roses, she cried softly and said, "This is how I'll picture him now, somewhere peaceful." That's when I understood what Sam had built. It wasn't a garden. It was healing, stitched together one petal at a time. When my daughter turned 18, I gave her a single envelope, the last letter from Sam's A box that I had never opened. It was addressed simply, "For whoever keeps the roses." She read it aloud under the same oak tree where Sam used to rest. "If you're reading this, then the garden has outlived me, and that's all I ever hoped for. These flowers aren't about sorrow. They're about thanks for the quiet mornings, for the friends we had, and for every sunrise that still comes. Keep planting. The world will always need beauty that remembers." Anna folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Then we'll keep planting." Now, years later, when I walk the rows at dusk, I sometimes see her out there, my grown daughter, sleeves rolled up, tending the roses with that same calm patience Sam once had. The petals brush her hands, and I swear the field hums softly around her, alive with memory. The sky above the plains stretches endless and forgiving. The last rays of light slide across the fields, touching every bloom with gold, and for a moment it feels as if the world itself is whispering thank you, because some stories don't end. They just keep blooming. Stories like this remind us that even the smallest acts can outlast time. If this journey into the past touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories waiting to be remembered before they fade away. Let's keep them alive together.